It was almost 3 in the morning. The office was quiet, the kind of silence that only came when every other desk was empty. A lone programmer sat in front of his glowing screen, eyes heavy but focused. He saw it, buried deep in the lines of code, a flaw. Not just a mistake, but something dangerous, something that could bring the whole system down. His chest tightened. He knew what this meant. Just hours before, he had tried to warn the CEO in an emergency meeting. He had spoken with all the courage. He had, explaining the risk, but the answer came cold and dismissive. The CEO waved him off in front of the entire team, more worried about investors and tomorrow's launch than the truth staring them in the face. Everyone in the room fell silent. Everyone looked at him like he didn't belong. Now, alone in the dark office, he opened his phone. His hands shook, but his voice was steady as he recorded his warning, documenting the flaw no one wanted to hear about. He saved the file, knowing the danger was real. The question lingered in his mind. Would anyone listen before it was too late? The warning he recorded was not the first time he had spoken up. For weeks he had been seeing small cracks in the code, tiny mistakes left unchecked. Every time he brought them up, the meetings ended the same way. A polite nod, a quick dismissal, and a reminder about deadlines. He was new compared to the veterans around him. He was also the only black programmer in the room, and though no one ever said it out loud, he felt the weight of being treated differently. When the CEO had brushed him off earlier that night, it wasn't just about the flaw. It was about trust, about being seen as credible. The CEO didn't even look up from his phone when he spoke, as if the words didn't matter, as if he didn't matter. The rest of the team avoided his eyes, too scared to agree, too worried about losing their place. The flaw he found wasn't small. It was buried in the payment system, the very heart of the new product. One wrong move and the entire platform could fail, exposing customers' money and data. He explained this in clear terms, but the CEO only smiled, straightened his expensive suit, and ended the meeting with a single sentence. "We launch tomorrow. That's final." Walking out of that room had been one of the loneliest moments of his career. He felt like he was carrying a truth no one wanted to hear. Still, he couldn't let it go. That was why, sitting alone at 2:47 a.m., he recorded his warning. Not for attention, not for praise, but because he needed proof that he tried. He uploaded the recording to his personal cloud, then emailed it to himself just in case. For a moment he hesitated. His finger hovered over the keyboard before he did something he never thought he would. He posted the warning on his almost forgotten LinkedIn page. The caption was short, almost too simple. "When you try to prevent disaster but no one listens." He expected nothing from it. Maybe a handful of views, maybe a like from an old coworker. But inside he felt lighter. At least he had spoken. At least someone, somewhere might see the truth if everything collapsed. By the time dawn touched the city skyline, the post had already gathered a dozen reactions. Other programmers left quiet comments, people who understood the frustration of being ignored. He didn't know it yet, but his words were about to spread further than he could imagine. And still, as he packed up his things and slipped his coffee-stained mug into his bag, a single thought haunted him. Would anyone actually care before it was too late? The morning of the launch felt like another world compared to the silence of the night before. The auditorium inside the company's headquarters was alive with excitement. Bright screens flashed with slogans about speed, innovation, and the future of payments. Rows of chairs filled with investors, journalists, and industry experts who had flown in just to witness the moment. Cameras were set up at every angle, waiting to capture history. The CEO walked onto the stage with the confidence of a man certain of victory. He smiled wide, his expensive suit shining under the lights. With arms spread open, he spoke as though he was about to unveil something world-changing. "Today," he declared, "we don't just launch a product, we launch a revolution." The room erupted in applause, people nodding, clapping, and whispering about the billions of dollars this system could generate. Far in the back corner, the programmer sat quietly. Unlike the suits in the front row, his seat was in the overflow. section with junior staff. His eyes kept drifting to his phone, which buzzed with quiet urgency. A colleague in the monitoring room had started sending him updates. At first, everything looked fine. The system was stable, the numbers were smooth. For a moment, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong. Maybe the flaw wouldn't be triggered. Maybe the sleepless nights and the ignored warnings were just noise. But then another message appeared. Strange traffic patterns showing up. A second one followed. Unusual spikes. Something doesn't look right. His stomach tightened. On stage, the CEO was bragging about the system's speed, showing charts that promised performance 4 times faster than the competition. Live demonstration followed, moving a massive amount of money in seconds. The audience gasped in amazement, phones snapping pictures, tweets flying out in real time. The irony was sharp. As the CEO claimed their security was impenetrable, the programmer's phone buzzed again, this time with urgency. The monitoring team was beginning to see real signs of intrusion. Someone out there was testing the system, probing for weaknesses, his flaw, the very one he had stayed up all night recording. Meanwhile, his overnight LinkedIn post had started to move faster than he expected. Notifications rolled in, shares, comments, programmers tagging each other. A well-known cybersecurity expert even responded publicly, warning that if the flaw described was real, the entire system was in danger. Soon, tech blogs picked it up, attaching screenshots of his words with headlines that made their way onto social feeds. Programmer warns of fatal flaw hours before TechFlow launch. Inside the room, none of the applause could hide the growing storm outside. Journalists were already checking their phones, whispers spreading through the audience. The CEO continued smiling, but even from the back, the programmer could see the faint tightness in his jaw. The tension was building louder than the clapping. The system had only been live for a few minutes. The world was celebrating what looked like a victory. But deep inside, he knew the truth. This wasn't the beginning of success. It was the countdown to collapse. The celebration on stage was still going strong when the first cracks appeared. At the back of the auditorium, the programmer's phone buzzed again, this time with a message that made his stomach sink. We're seeing major spikes, possible breach attempts. He looked up from the glowing screen, the applause echoing around him like a cruel joke. The CEO's voice thundered through the speakers, boasting about flawless security and claiming their platform was untouchable. Meanwhile, just a few floors above the crowd, the monitoring room was beginning to look like a war zone. Screens flashed red warnings, alarms beeped, and engineers scrambled at their desks, typing frantically to hold back something far larger than they were prepared for. The flaw was no longer theory. It was being exploited. Real money was disappearing. Accounts were being accessed, and the numbers on the screen spun out of control. The programmer rushed out of the auditorium, heart racing, and pushed his way into the control room. His colleague met him with wide eyes and a single sentence. It's happening. Exactly what you said. He didn't waste time on anger or frustration. He went straight to the terminal, scanning lines of errors, his worst fears confirmed. The vulnerability was live, and hackers were inside the system, tearing it apart piece by piece. Back in the auditorium, the CEO's performance began to falter. A journalist raised her hand, phone in the air, reading from a breaking alert. Reports are spreading online that your system has critical flaws. Did your team ignore warnings? For the first time, the CEO's confident smile wavered. He brushed the question aside, but the unease in the crowd was growing. People checked their phones, whispers spread, and more reporters leaned forward, with questions that refused to go away. In the monitoring room, the situation was spiraling. Transactions had slowed to a crawl. Unauthorized access was spreading across multiple banks. Engineers were shouting over one another, demanding the system be shut down. The programmer worked faster, fingers flying over the keyboard, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. Every second, more accounts were compromised. Then came the moment of no return. The main server connection dropped. The room went silent except for the steady beep of failed systems. A senior administrator's voice broke through. The platform is down. Completely down. On the giant live stream in the auditorium, the celebration froze in an instant. Investors clutched their phones, news outlets fired off urgent updates, and the CEO's empire began to unravel in front of the world. His voice, once booming with confidence, now trembled as he muttered something about routine maintenance. But everyone knew the truth. At that same moment, social media caught fire. The programmer's late-night warning had gone viral. His words, ignored in the boardroom, were now being quoted by thousands online. A new hashtag was spreading like wildfire. Listen to him. Inside the monitoring room, the programmer pushed back from the terminal, knowing the system had crossed the point of saving. But this was no longer about code. It was about accountability, truth, and the voice that had been silenced for too long. The crash was no longer just technical. It was personal, corporate, and global. The moment the system went dark, the story broke open. What was meant to be the company's proudest day turned into a stage of chaos. Investors shouted into their phones, journalists rushed to file breaking updates, and the CEO stood frozen under the harsh lights, his once confident grin nowhere to be found. Reporters began firing questions at him, one after another, each one sharper than the last. "Is it true there's a vulnerability in your payment system?" one demanded. "Why did you launch without fixing it?" another pressed. But the question that cut the deepest came from the front row. "One of your own developers posted a warning at 3 a.m, saying you dismissed him. Is that true?" The CEO's polished mask cracked. For the first time, his voice trembled. He tried to brush it off as differences of opinion, but by then the evidence was everywhere. Screens across the room lit up with the viral post. The programmer's words, written in the stillness of the night, were now being quoted by news anchors, tech blogs, and cybersecurity experts around the world. Back in the monitoring room, the programmer realized the silence was over. His truth had been ignored in the boardroom, but it was now echoing across the globe. He straightened his shoulders, knowing it was time to step out of the shadows. Walking back toward the auditorium, his phone buzzed nonstop. Messages of support, shares of his post, and comments from strangers who believed him. The very voice that was silenced hours ago was now the loudest one in the building. When he entered the hall, all eyes turned. The once noisy crowd fell quiet. Reporters recognized him instantly. "That's the developer," someone whispered. Cameras swung toward him. The CEO's face shifted from shock to something darker, fear, maybe even regret. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, a silent replay of the meeting where warnings were brushed aside like nothing. A reporter broke the silence. "Can you explain what really happened?" The programmer didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and played the recording he had made at 2:47 a.m. His voice carried through the speakers, steady and clear, a documented warning about the flaw, naming exactly where the danger lived in the code. The audience listened in stunned silence as his words echoed. When the recording ended, he spoke directly to the room. "This wasn't a difference of opinion," he said firmly. "This was a flaw I identified and reported. I was told it didn't matter. And today, nearly 1 million people have been put at risk because of that choice." The room erupted. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled furiously, and investors turned on the CEO with looks of pure anger. The story was no longer about a technical failure. It was about arrogance, about silencing expertise, about ignoring the voices that mattered most. The programmer stood tall, not with pride, but with the quiet strength of someone who had carried the truth alone for too long. Now finally the world was listening. The press conference that morning would be remembered for years, but not as a triumph. By the end of the day, it had become a symbol of arrogance and failure. News channels ran live coverage of the collapse, and social media exploded with anger. The company's stock price plunged in real time, losing billions of dollars in value within hours. Investors demanded answers, partners began severing contracts, and lawsuits started to pile up before the day was even over. But while the financial damage made headlines, it was the human stories that cut the deepest. Families woke up to find their bank accounts drained. Small businesses couldn't pay their employees. Elderly customers logged in only to discover their savings had vanished. Every one of those losses was a reminder that this wasn't just about numbers, it was about people. And that was exactly what the programmer had tried to protect from the very beginning. By the evening, his inbox was flooded. Job offers, speaking invitations, interview requests, they poured in faster than he could read them. Yet, the messages that touched him most were from strangers who had faced the same silence he once did. A young engineer wrote, "Your courage gave me the strength to report an issue my boss ignored." A medical technician added, "I showed your story to my team. They listened. We fixed a flaw that could have hurt patients." Across industries, people saw themselves in his fight. At the same time, the CEO was a man unraveling. Once the face of power and confidence, he now looked like someone carrying the weight of his own downfall. The cameras caught his pale face, his faltering voice, his desperate attempts to control a story that was already out of his hands. Late that night, he appeared at the programmer's door. No cameras, no press, just a broken man, older than he had looked the day before. His voice cracked as he apologized, and in a stunning moment he offered his own job as a way to make amends. The programmer didn't hesitate. He refused. He didn't want the corner office or the title. What he wanted was something bigger, something deeper. "This was never about me versus you," he told him quietly. "It was about the people we were supposed to protect. When you ignored my voice, you ignored them. That's the real cost." The CEO lowered his eyes, finally stripped of all his polished arrogance. For the first time, he seemed to understand. He admitted that deadlines, investors, and market pressure had blinded him to the truth that mattered most. But those words, spoken in regret, could not undo the damage. By then, the story had grown beyond the company. It had become a movement. Around the world, workers began sharing their own stories under a new rallying cry. Listen to him. But it wasn't really about one man. It was about every unheard voice, every warning dismissed, every truth ignored until disaster struck. And in the middle of it all stood the quiet programmer, no longer invisible, no longer silenced. He hadn't asked for the spotlight. But now, he carried it, not for fame, but for change. Months passed, but the echoes of that disastrous launch never faded. The company never truly recovered. Its stock remained shattered, lawsuits dragged on, and its once bright reputation had been permanently stained. Yet, in the middle of all the wreckage, something new began to grow. Out of the collapse, a movement took shape. A single voice that had once been silenced became the reason others dared to speak. The programmer, once hidden in the back of the office, was now invited to speak on stages across the world. He stood in conference halls, classrooms, and auditoriums, filled with people who wanted to hear the lessons he had learned. But he never spoke with the arrogance of a man who wanted attention. Instead, he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew the cost of being ignored. At the annual Tech Ethics Conference, the room was packed beyond capacity. CEOs, engineers, students, and journalists filled every seat, and many more stood in the back. For once, the spotlight didn't belong to investors or executives. It belonged to a quiet coder who had once stayed up through the night trying to do the right thing. He opened with a question that cut through the room like a blade. How many of you have ever seen a problem at work and felt like no one wanted to listen? Hands went up everywhere. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Everyone had felt that sting, the dismissal, the silence, the weight of being right but unheard. He told them his story, not as a hero's tale, but as a warning. He described the flaw in the system, the night he documented it, and the moment he was brushed aside because he didn't fit the image of who the CEO wanted to hear. He didn't hide his frustration, but he also didn't speak with bitterness. Instead, he focused on what it meant to value the people who often saw the truth first, the workers deep in the trenches. Slides behind him showed the cost: $87 million lost, nearly 1 million accounts compromised, and a company brought to its knees. But then he shifted to another set of slides, stories from other industries, an aerospace company that avoided a disaster because they finally listened to a junior engineer, a hospital that prevented a dangerous recall because a technician's voice was taken seriously, a startup that patched a flaw in time because diversity in the team brought new eyes to old problems. The real cost of silence isn't measured in dollars, he said, his voice steady. It's measured in trust. In the lives disrupted, the families hurt, the opportunities lost, and all because someone thought they knew better than the people doing the work. The applause was thunderous, but he raised his hand to quiet it. He didn't want cheers. He wanted change. I'm not here to tell you to admire me, he continued. I'm here to tell you to listen, to the voices you usually overlook, to the people you underestimate, to the warnings you'd rather ignore, because those voices might be the ones that save you. As he stepped off the stage, his phone buzzed with new messages. But it wasn't job offers or interviews this time. It was stories. A young developer wrote that she had spoken up about a vulnerability, and her team fixed it before release. A nurse shared that she finally convinced her manager to double-check a safety protocol. Each message was proof that things were changing, piece by piece. Later that evening, he sat alone in his apartment, the same mug his grandmother had given, him resting on the table. World's best problem solver. He smiled, remembering her text from the night of the collapse, how proud she had been to see him stand tall when it mattered most. He knew the fight wasn't over. Arrogance and bias didn't vanish overnight. There would always be deadlines, investors, and leaders who thought they knew better. But there would also be people like him. People who stayed up late, people who saw the cracks, people who carried the burden of truth even when it was heavy. And now, thanks to one viral warning, the world was beginning to listen. The story didn't end with his victory. The story ended with a promise that the most important code wasn't written in programs or systems, it was written in culture. A culture where voices mattered, where expertise was valued, and where protecting people came before protecting pride. And as he closed his laptop that night, the thought returned, the same one he'd carried in silence months before. Only this time it didn't haunt him, it inspired him. Would anyone listen before it was too late? Now finally, the answer was yes.